Go.
Okay. Is it good? Are we set? And can you see me?
I
hope.
just see the background. I just see the background. I don't see you. Now I see you.
Okay. All right. I can't seem to fix the background for the moment, so don't worry about it. I will just speak from here and see if I can fix the class. Hold on just 1 second, everybody. Screen. Let's do photos. Just Zoom. Okay. Is that good? How's that? Okay. All right. Never mind. We have a little bit of a technical glitch, but it's on my side. And so I'm just going to start the class, and don't worry about it. We will continue with the Sinai on one side and the .la, which was a podcast I did earlier today, on the other, since I don't know how to fix it. Anyway, I want to make at least a couple of comments that may be helpful with you on Pesach and for your Seder. And I'm also going to try, if I can, to follow on our home screen, so that if you want to ask me questions about this, I will be able also to see the questions that you are asking. Comments that may be helpful with and you. There you hear me speaking after myself. Okay, I said 3 lessons about Passover, and the truth is that the lessons about Passover are to some extent unique this year, and to some extent are perpetual for any Pesach, because what makes Passover unique this year is what made the first Passover unique, which is, if you remember from the biblical story, God tells everyone to stay in their house. That idea that you should stay in your house is the idea that the Malach HaMavet, the angel of death, is going to pass, and you don't want to be outside when the angel of death does. That is stunningly similar to the predicament in which we find ourselves. Obviously, we don't think of it quite the same way as the Malach HaMavet, who, if he sees blood on your doorpost, will know this is a Jewish home and therefore skip over it. Rather, this is the Malach HaMavet who, if he sees a mask on your face, will know that it's a careful person and skip over it. At least that is one's hope. Nonetheless, the idea that we are celebrating Passover with the awareness of mortality is a throwback to the original Pesach, and is a powerful lesson for us to share, because after all of the Torah is, in a sense, an education in our own mortality. And that is something that I will come back to when I get to the end of the Seder. But right now we're just at the beginning. So the first lesson of it is that Pesach is about order and disorder. It's about order in the most obvious way, because the Seder means order, and Kadesh or Chatz, and on. All of those steps for the Seder are reminders that the sequence is the substance, that you cannot do the Seder in any order you want, just like you can't do it in any day that you want. In order to make it a Seder, you have to do it in a certain organized sequence, and that's a sort of bulwark against the chaos and disorder that is a function of our age and a function of our predicament. And when you remember that the Seder is that, you realize that in a larger sense, the Jewish tradition is like that. Halakha, Jewish law, is an ordering of your life, and it provides a buffer and a shield against the chaotic nature of the world that again and again weighs in upon us and forces us to make adjustments to the perfection of our own lives in order to accommodate what it is that the world needs. So at the beginning of the Seder, we affirm our conviction and belief in God's ordering of the world, and as a model of that in our own ordering of the Pesach Seder that allows us to celebrate in this way with the people around us. That's one. Of course, that is just the beginning of the Seder's reality and ordering, because once you have done that, that is, once you have ordered the Seder, then it is your obligation to follow the order. And in following the order of the Seder, we find something that is known but deserves some powerful emphasis, which is that the ordering of the Seder culminates in the songs that are designed to speak to children. The Chad Gadya, the Echad Mi Yodea, all of that. These are songs that are hopefully to get the kids to stay up till the end of the Seder, even though they haven't faced the challenges in staying up that their parents have, because presumably the kids have not had 4 cups of wine. Nonetheless, even without the wine, I remember all of us fading when we were little kids at the end of the Seder. And of course, this in part depends on how long your Seder is. But why is it that the Seder is so child designed? A colleague of mine made the point that even though it's designed on the symposium, that is the Greek symposium, where the most famous example, of course, is in Plato, that at the symposium, there are no kids. It's not as though Plato and Socrates say, oh, look at that little kid over there, let's bring him over and entertain him for the evening. No. But the Jewish tradition is extremely child-centric in this sense, in the sense that it understands that without engaging the children in the transmission of the tradition from an early age, that you will have a much less rooted sense of the tradition when you get older. And what the Talmud calls Girsa Diyankuta, the version of your youth, takes root inside you in a way that is more powerful than almost anything else. So if you haven't heard a song for many, many, many years that you were sung to as a child and you hear it, it touches something inside you that is very deep and anchors you in your own past. And so when we talk about the Seder, we are in fact sort of reifying, making real that which runs through the entire tradition. You should tell your children. And in the Shema, right? These words, you walk on your way and you shall tell them, teach them to your children. And why do you have to do that with the central words of the tradition? Because after all, without that grip on the young mind and heart in a world that is predominantly not Jewish, where Judaism is a countercultural tradition, without that grip on the mind and heart, it's very easy to lose hold of Jewish souls in the world. And so from a very early age, we seek to embrace the children, even at the Seder. And of course, the Seder is also, which appeals to children, the Seder is a story. And even though you repeat the story over and over and over again, I remember the wise words of my teacher in rabbinical school, Neil Gilman, who said, if you want to know the power of ritual, all you have to do is read a child his or her favorite story at night and change a single word. Because if you change a word, you will see that they get very upset. and they get upset because they know all the words. It's not as though they have to be told what the word is, but the reading of the story itself is ritualistic. Itself is an expression of that deep need that everyone has that goes back to the first point, which is Seder or order, for the world to observe certain consistent realities that enable us to make our way through what is an often difficult, chaotic, and tragic world. So there we have the first 2 points of the Seder, the first 2 lessons of the Seder that I wanted to emphasize. One is order, and the second is children. The third lesson is the lesson of redemption. And here I'd like to remind you of things that we have talked about before, but at the Seder, they become so concrete and so poignant at the same time that they take on a different aspect as if viewed from an angle that is unique to the Pesach Seder. And that is this. We are reading in the Seder about the redemption of the Jewish people. I mean, that's after all what the Seder celebrates, right? You brought us out of the land of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. We're reading about the redemption. We read about the miracles. We read about the plagues. And this is the liberation that we hope for and pray for. It is the beginning of the story of the Jewish people. And at the same time as we tell the beginning of the story, we also anticipate the end of the story. Because the end of the story is not going into the land of Israel. That might seem like the end of the story, but in fact, as we know, when the Jews go into Israel in the book of Joshua, it is hardly the grand culmination. In fact, in some ways, Joshua is a very difficult book because it doesn't speak of wondrous miracles and perfect harmony and peace. And so the idea of redemption is a more complicated idea than we might anticipate from reading just the beginning of the Seder. And even the children's songs, like Chad Gadya, make it clear that the rabbis were very well aware of the cycle of life and the cycle of death, right? Because in all of those, as in nursery rhymes and as in Grimm's fairy tales, you see that there is both a realization of the gruesomeness and power of death, and also the reality and hope of salvation. And that's what you get in a song like Chad Gadya, whether there's death or there's life. But then you open the door for Elijah. And the opening of the door for Elijah is not just something that you enable the kids to do, which is a beautiful thing, but at the same time, remember you say, pour out your wrath on the nations. That is, you open the door both to ask God for the vengeance, for the tragedies that the Jewish people have survived and endured, and in some cases, of course, not survived, and you hope for a redemption where such atrocities will never be a part of the world. And so as Pesach celebrates a redemption in which the Jews were saved, it acknowledges a history in which all too often we have not been saved. And that combination is extremely powerful, because you cannot sit at the Pesach Seder and think that we have had a beautiful, perfect history. You read about how the rabbis sat around, Rabbi Akiva, Rabban Gamliel, and you know, partly from hints in the Haggadah and partly from just our own knowledge of Jewish history, that these rabbis lived at the time of the Roman Empire and after the destruction of the temple, which means that they lived in a time of expression of Jewish tragedy. And that the Seder was for them not just a retrospective act of gratitude and fealty to God, but also a prospective hope that the liberation that was will one day be again. And on this year, of course, that both retrospective and prospective hope is rekindled in a powerful way because we understand what it is in different ways in different times, and with all the caveats that are necessary here. The Hebrew word lahavdil is very helpful. It means to the difference. In other words, I'm making a comparison, but I acknowledge that this comparison is not a perfect one, because on this year, we understand what it is to both absorb the story of liberation and also hope for our own story of liberation. In past Passovers, we would go around the table and do things like, what enslaves you this year? You know? And people would generally make it a personal comment. What enslaves me is habit or addiction or my job or something like that. There were societies, the most famous recent one was the Soviet Union, where the feeling was, what enslaves me is the government and the society in which I find myself. And if I could leave this country, or if the government would change or their policy would change, I would be liberated in a way that I cannot now quite imagine. But this is the first time in our lifetime where the world as a whole feels a certain sense of servitude to that which it cannot on its own conquer. And so you sit around the Pesach table, and I think in some ways, in spirit, although again, this is not a perfect alignment of analogy, you get a sense of what it is that the tradition is telling us about the history of the Jewish people and even the history of humanity and what it means to feel enslaved despite the fact that in other ways you can be free. And if you put all three of these together, these three lessons of Seder, of order, of children, and of redemption, you realize that in some way they are one grand sort of circle of lessons that the Jewish tradition teaches. That the order of the world, which we transmit to our children and teach them, if we observe it well enough and transmit it well enough, will eventually lead to a world that is redeemed. I mean, that's what the Jewish tradition says and promises, is that yes, right now you live in an unredeemed world, but you can make it better. And if you make it better, you will see that you will be climbing the ladder to redemption. And the way you see this most vividly is in the Haftarah that we read on Shabbat HaGadol before Pesach, which is the prophet Malachi who says, "Veheshiv levavot al banim v'lev banim al avotam," that we will return parents to children and children to their parents. In other words, that we will create a world in which people are loving to one another, beginning at the Seder with the family. So those lessons, which start off seemingly disparate one from the other, they sort of come together in a beautiful circle. That the order of the world allows the raising of children who will fix the order of the world. And that faith, not in what children are today, but in what they can be if taught well, that faith is really why Judaism is child-centric. Because each generation knows that it hasn't done it as well as it could, and that there is a possibility of doing it better, and that you can build on the increments of earlier generations to, as the famous phrase has it, that's attributed to Newton, but actually goes back far before Newton. If I've seen farther than other men, it's because I've stood on the shoulders of giants. That idea that children will do better, not necessarily because they are intrinsically better than their parents, although many are, but because they stand on the shoulders of their parents and therefore can see farther. And that's one of the reasons why you have a child open the door for Elijah, because it's the next generation that Elijah comes to rescue from the world and the pains of the world. And so the Passover Seder is a meal in which we understand that there is an element of handing on the story to the children who will carry that story forward. And that is the essential religious task. Because after all, as you know and I know, what it is primarily that we carry from those who came before us is inside of us in a deep way are their stories. And that when someone speaks of who they are, when you say, "Who are you?" they tell you a story. And that the Jewish story tries to be part of the personal story, that it's not just that you have your own story, but also that you're part of this grand collective narrative that goes back thousands of years and, God willing, goes forward until the end of time. And the Passover Seder is the moment that we went from family to people and also from slavery to freedom, and gave the world the story that it still remembers and celebrates every year. So I hope that on this Pesach, in your well-ordered meal, that either in person or on Zoom, you will have children, young or old, that you will be able to hear from them and tell them the story. And it's particularly poignant this year because I think we live in a generation where for the first time in human history, young people had indispensable skills that their elders did not. It's not like years ago, young people were born with knowledge of agriculture that older people didn't have, or business, or finance, or almost anything else. But technology has been largely the province of the young. And so this year, we get to tell our story to the young through the means that the young are helping to provide to the old. It is a beautiful, paradoxical circle on this Passover. But whoever is in charge of your Zoom or your YouTube, whatever knowledge they have, I hope that it will enable you to tell a beautiful story and to have a chag kasher v'sameach, a kosher, a happy, a joyous, and most of all this year, a very healthy Passover. Thank you.